Okay, so get ready to explore the Spanish frontier north. We're talking about a period of history that's so much more than conquistadors and gold. It's a story full of surprises, epic journeys, and wild myths. You've got some great sources lined up for us, so what can our listeners expect to uncover in this deep dive?
We're going beyond that typical conquest narrative you might be used to. We'll be unpacking the motivations, the challenges, and the crucial role of indigenous peoples in shaping this era.
Sounds fascinating. I'm ready to dive in. So, we all know the story of the Spanish conquest of Mexico, but what happened after that? What drew them further north into this harsh and unfamiliar territory?
It's easy to assume it was all about the gold.
Right.
And while the discovery of silver mines in Chichimeca territory did play a role, there were other powerful forces at play, too.
Like what?
Well, this was a time when religious fervor was sweeping through Europe, and Spain was no exception. Many Spaniards genuinely believed it was their God-given duty to spread Christianity, even if it meant venturing into the unknown.
Wow. Talk about extreme faith.
Right.
But it wasn't just about converting people, was it? It sounds like there were some pretty worldly motivations at play, too.
Absolutely. Let's not forget about glory. For ambitious Spaniards, venturing into this uncharted territory was a chance to win honor, climb the social ladder, and maybe even snag a land grant from the king. It was a high-stakes gamble, fueled by a thirst for adventure and social mobility.
So it's like those fantasy series we binge today, but with real-life consequences. Okay, we've got gold, God, and glory as our driving forces. That's a potent combination. And that set the stage for some incredible expeditions, but it also led to some pretty wild myths and legends, right?
Absolutely. And that's where things get really interesting. Let's talk about Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. He was a Spaniard who shipwrecked on what is now the coast of Texas and ended up wandering across the Southwest for 8 years, living among various indigenous groups.
8 years. Talk about a survival story. I can't even imagine being stranded in a totally foreign land for that long. And he eventually found his way back to Mexico, right?
He did, and when he returned, he was like a celebrity, sharing these incredible tales of his journey.
He spoke of grand cities called Cuera and Cibola, filled with unimaginable riches. These stories captivated the imaginations of Spaniards, many of whom were already primed by popular novels describing mythical lands overflowing with gold.
So it's like going viral in the 16th century.
Yeah.
People were eating up these stories of golden cities, even without any proof.
Right.
It makes you wonder how much was genuine observation, how much was indigenous storytelling, and how much was pure embellishment.
It's a fascinating blend. And these myths weren't just idle stories. They had a real impact on the course of exploration. In fact, they fueled several expeditions, including one led by a Franciscan friar named Marcos de Niza.
And Denisa was guided by a fascinating character named Estebanico, a Moroccan slave who had also survived that shipwreck with Cabeza de Vaca.
Oh, absolutely.
What's their story?
Well, Denisa was driven by the potential for converting indigenous populations to Christianity. Guided by Estebanico, he journeyed north and returned with reports of seeing a golden city in the distance.
Wow.
While his claims were later proven to be exaggerated, they were convincing enough to spark one of the most famous expeditions of all, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado's epic journey into the Southwest.
Ah, Coronado. Now, there's an expedition that captured the imagination. He set out with hundreds of men, thousands of livestock.
Yeah.
It was a massive undertaking, right?
It was an undertaking of incredible scale. It's important to understand the sheer logistics of it all. Coronado's expedition wasn't just a few guys on horseback. It was a logistical feat with hundreds of men, thousands of livestock to feed them along the way. Think of them as their portable refrigerators. Plus, they had a parallel maritime expedition led by Hernando de Alarcón. And remember, they were venturing into uncharted territory with limited geographical knowledge and relying heavily on the knowledge and support of indigenous allies.
Allies who not only fought alongside the Spanish, but also provided essential knowledge of the land and its resources. It really drives home the point that indigenous peoples were not simply passive bystanders in this story, but active participants who could make or break an expedition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while Coronado never actually found those fabled cities of gold, his expedition did open up vast territories for Spanish expansion and, unintentionally, laid the groundwork for future settlements. Of course, this expansion also led to some very brutal clashes with indigenous groups.
Like the Spanish attack on the Pueblo of Acoma. It's a stark reminder of the violence inherent in conquest. But at the same time, these events sparked important debates, even within Spanish society, didn't they? Debates about the ethics of conquest, about the treatment of native populations, about just war.
Exactly. These debates, fueled by events like the Acoma attack, went on to shape Spanish policies for decades to come. Now, while Coronado's quest might be the most famous, it's just one piece of the puzzle. To truly understand how the Spanish solidified their control over this vast and challenging frontier, we need to look at the strategies they employed. Essentially, they relied on three major pillars: missions, urbanization, and presidios.
Okay, let's break those down. Missions, I imagine, were more than just places of worship.
You're right. While their primary purpose was to convert indigenous populations to Christianity, missions also became centers of social control. They often acted as a buffer between native communities and the sometimes exploitative practices of Spanish settlers. The Jesuits and Franciscans, in particular, played a significant role in establishing these mission systems.
And what about urbanization? How did founding cities help solidify Spanish control?
Think of it this way. Cities were centers of power. Often built on or near existing indigenous settlements, they became hubs for trade, administration, and Spanish cultural influence. They projected an image of Spanish dominance and encouraged the assimilation of native populations into a Spanish way of life.
So you've got these centers of religion and these centers of Spanish power, and then you have the presidios. Am I right in picturing those as those classic Wild West forts, strategically placed to protect key locations?
That's a pretty accurate image, though they evolved over time. Initially, they were small military outposts, strategically placed along trade routes to protect travelers and goods from raids. As the frontier pushed further north, they grew into larger, more fortified structures, much like the forts we associate with the later American West.
So you've got these three pillars: missions, cities, and presidios, all working together to establish a Spanish foothold. But, and I think we both know the answer to this, it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it? I mean, the Spanish encountered some pretty fierce resistance, especially as they ventured further into Chichimeca territory.
That's right, and that's where we see the Spanish war machine encountering a very different kind of enemy and a very different kind of war.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. Tell me more about the Chichimecas and how they challenged the Spanish.
The Chichimecas were unlike any foe the Spanish had encountered before. These weren't the Aztecs, with their centralized empire and elaborate cities.
Okay.
We're talking about a whole collection of nomadic groups, masters of guerrilla warfare, who used the vast, unforgiving terrain to their advantage.
It's like showing up to a gunfight with a sword. How did the Spanish ever stand a chance against that kind of enemy?
It threw them for a loop, that's for sure.
Yeah.
The discovering silver in Chichimeca territory only intensified the conflict, igniting what became known as the Chichimeca War.
Wow.
Imagine decades of brutal struggle that truly tested Spanish military might. Casualties mounted, the economy was disrupted, and the Spanish realized their old tactics just weren't gonna cut it.
So what did they do? How do you fight an enemy that's practically invisible and always a step ahead?
They had to adapt.
Go.
And that meant embracing a whole new approach. For
Fair.
starters, they started employing indigenous allies.
Right.
People who knew the terrain and the Chichimeca's fighting style. Talk about fighting fire with fire.
Makes sense. Who better to track down a guerrilla army than another guerrilla army, right?
Right.
What else did they do?
Well, they realized they needed to control the playing field.
Right.
So they started strategically relocating pacified indigenous groups,
Okay.
like the Tlaxcalans, into Chichimeca territory.
Okay, so almost like trying to establish little pockets of, at least in their view, civilized living within this war zone. What was the thinking there?
It was twofold.
Okay.
For one, these relocated groups served as a buffer,
Okay.
but they were also meant to be examples of the benefits of, let's say, cooperating with the Spanish.
Right.
It was a form of cultural persuasion, albeit a rather forceful one, to encourage assimilation.
And let's not forget about those missions we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
I'm guessing they took on a whole new importance in this kind of conflict.
Absolutely. The Spanish realized that military might alone wouldn't win this war. They needed to win hearts and minds as well.
Right.
Missions became essential tools for promoting peaceful interaction, providing essential services to the Chichimeca people, and, yes, encouraging conversion to Christianity.
Right.
It was a recognition that sometimes the most effective weapon is a helping hand, or at least the appearance of one.
It's a fascinating and complex period, full of these kinds of contradictions.
Yeah.
Speaking of complex, we can't talk about the Spanish frontier north without mentioning the Mixton War. It sounds like something straight out of a movie title.
Oh, it was very real.
Okay.
And a major turning point in the struggle for control of the frontier. Picture this. It's 1540, and the indigenous population in northwestern Mexico has reached their breaking point. Fed up with the oppressive labor practices imposed on them by the Spanish encomenderos, they rise up in a coordinated rebellion that takes the Spanish completely by surprise.
Wait, back up a bit. Who are the encomenderos?
Essentially, they were Spanish colonists who were granted the right to extract labor and tribute from indigenous communities.
Okay.
In exchange, they were supposed to provide protection and ensure their conversion to Christianity.
Right.
But in reality, it often turned into a system of exploitation and abuse.
So the Mixton War was a direct response to this exploitation, a fight for indigenous autonomy and dignity.
Precisely. The Cascan people, led by a charismatic leader named Tenemaxtli, orchestrated this uprising. They retreated to fortified mountain strongholds called Peñoles, using the terrain to their advantage. It was guerrilla warfare on a whole new level.
Right.
And it really shook the Spanish.
It sounds like the Spanish were caught completely off guard.
Yeah.
How did they respond to such a formidable challenge?
They realized they needed to bring out the big guns.
Literally.
Literally. They assembled a massive army, complete with artillery, to lay siege to the Cascan strongholds.
Wow.
It was a brutal and bloody conflict.
Yeah.
But the Spanish eventually prevailed, though not without heavy losses.
I can imagine. But even in victory, this must have been a wake-up call for the Spanish. A clear sign that controlling this frontier and its people wouldn't be easy.
Absolutely. The Mixton War forced them to reevaluate their strategies and acknowledge the resilience and determination of the indigenous people they sought to subjugate. It's a stark reminder that the conquest of the Americas was not a one-sided affair. Indigenous resistance shaped the course of events.
Okay, so we've got rebellion and adaptation, but the story of the Spanish frontier north is also a story of individuals, right? People like Francisco Ibarra, for example.
Ah, Ibarra.
Yeah.
Now, there was an ambitious young conquistador, if there ever was one.
Wow.
In the 1560s, driven by rumors of silver mines and the desire to carve his name into the history books, he leads a series of expeditions into what is now northwestern Mexico.
Wow.
He was a study in contrasts, a skilled explorer and strategist, but also ruthless in his pursuit of wealth and glory.
Sounds like he had that classic conquistador combination of ambition and ruthlessness. What makes his expedition so significant in the grand scheme of things?
Ibarra was a master of playing both sides. He could forge alliances with some indigenous groups when it suited him.
Okay.
But he wouldn't hesitate to crush others who stood in his way.
So it's a story of carrots and sticks diplomacy 1 minute and brute force the next.
Exactly. And you know what they say about walking a tightrope?
Yeah.
He managed to open up vast new territories for Spanish exploitation.
Right.
But he also left a long trail of bloodshed and resentment in his wake.
Ibarra's story perfectly encapsulates that volatile mix of ambition, violence, and indigenous resistance that define this era.
Right.
It's a reminder that history is never black and white, but rather a million shades of gray. Now, we've talked about the Spanish military and the various tactics they employed, but what about the role of the church, specifically the Jesuits? We touched on them briefly, but I'm curious to learn more about their role in shaping the frontier.
The Jesuits were fascinating. Unlike some other orders, they were known for their discipline, their intellectualism, and, most importantly, their ability to adapt their methods to different cultural contexts.
How so?
To convert the indigenous population, they didn't just impose their beliefs. Yeah. They learned the native languages, studied local customs, and sometimes even incorporated elements of indigenous practices into their teachings.
Wow, that's a really different approach. Talk about understanding your audience. So it was kind of like a blend of cultural sensitivity and religious zeal.
Yeah.
Did it work?
To a certain extent, yes.
Okay.
This approach, while controversial in some circles, proved surprisingly effective in winning converts, at least compared to more forceful methods.
Right.
The Jesuits were particularly active in the northwestern frontier, establishing a chain of missions across Sonora, Sinaloa, and Baja California. They became major landowners, developed sophisticated agricultural practices, and created these self-sufficient, albeit tightly controlled, mission communities.
It sounds almost idyllic, but I imagine it wasn't without its problems. There had to be some inherent tension in that dynamic, right?
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
While the Jesuits often shielded indigenous communities from the worst abuses of Spanish settlers,
right,
they also imposed a rigid system of work and religious observance.
Right.
That led to accusations of exploitation, cultural suppression, and even sparked resistance and rebellions within some mission communities.
It proves that even with seemingly good intentions, the collision of cultures rarely goes smoothly. It reminds me of another key figure in this story, Juan de Oñate.
Right.
He led the first successful colonization effort into what is now New Mexico.
Right.
But his legacy is mired in controversy.
Oñate is a complex figure for sure.
Yeah.
He arrives in the late 16th century with a very specific goal.
Okay.
To establish a permanent Spanish colony.
Right.
Think families, soldiers, Franciscan friars, the whole works.
Wow.
This was colonization with a capital C.
Right.
And in 1610, they founded the city of Santa Fe, which became the capital of the new province of New Mexico.
Talk about a power move. That's a major step toward solidifying Spanish control. But you mentioned controversy. What's the story there?
Well, let's just say Oñate wasn't known for his gentle touch.
Right.
He believed in crushing any resistance, no matter how small.
Wow.
And the most horrific example of this is the Acoma massacre.
Right.
After a tense standoff with the Acoma people at their Mesa Top village, Oñate soldiers launched a brutal assault, killing hundreds, including women and children.
That's horrifying. It's hard to imagine that level of brutality. It certainly casts a dark shadow over his accomplishments.
It does. Even some Spaniards were appalled by the Acoma massacre.
Right.
And Oñate was eventually removed from his governorship.
Right.
But by then, the damage was done.
Right.
Santa Fe stood as a symbol of Spanish dominance, and his expedition ushered in a new era of Spanish presence in the Southwest, for better or worse.
It's a sobering reminder that the history of the frontier is often written in blood. And as we move into the 17th century, the landscape of warfare continues to evolve with the arrival of a new and formidable adversary, the Apaches.
The Apaches were a game changer. Unlike the more settled Pueblo peoples, they were incredibly mobile, masters of equestrian warfare, and fiercely resistant to any attempts at Spanish control or conversion.
Right.
They were a constant thorn in the side of the Spanish, raiding settlements, disrupting trade routes, and always vanishing back into the vast landscape before the Spanish could retaliate.
It sounds like the Spanish were completely outmatched in this new kind of war. Their old tactics of brute force and siege warfare wouldn't work against an enemy as elusive and adaptable as the Apaches.
Exactly. The Spanish had to learn to adapt or face constant harassment.
Oh.
They began relying even more heavily on indigenous allies, especially the Pueblos, who were also feeling the pressure from Apache raids.
Okay.
They also expanded their network of presidios, those military outposts we talked about earlier, trying to create a defensive web to protect against these lightning raids.
It sounds like a chaotic and dangerous time to be alive, a constant struggle for control in a land where the rules of warfare were constantly evolving. And as we'll see, the Apaches were just one of many challenges the Spanish would face. We've covered a lot of ground exploring the human side of the Spanish frontier north, the clash of ambitions, the cultures. But it wasn't just a human story, was it?
No, not at all.
The land itself played a major role, and not always a willing one. Right. I'm really curious to dig into the environmental impact of the Spanish arrival.
It's something that's often overlooked, but the environmental changes were dramatic. The Spanish brought with them an ecological invasion, if you will.
Okay.
Horses, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, animals that had never set hoof on this land before, suddenly became part of the landscape.
Whoa. Talk about unintended consequences. It's like they brought over a few cows and accidentally unleashed ecological chaos. Did they even realize the impact these animals would have?
I don't think so. They were focused on survival, expansion, not necessarily on long-term consequences, but those consequences were significant.
Right.
These introduced species transformed grazing patterns, spread diseases to native wildlife, and competed for resources. It was a ripple effect through the entire ecosystem.
It's like throwing a rock into a pond and watching the ripples spread out in all directions. What about the way they used the land itself? I mean, the Spanish weren't exactly known for their light footprint, were they?
No, they weren't. They brought their own ideas about agriculture and land management, which often clashed with existing indigenous practices.
Okay.
They cleared vast tracts of land for crops, diverted waterways for irrigation, and generally altered the way water flowed and land was used. All of this led to deforestation, soil erosion, and changes in water availability. That impacted both human and animal communities.
So it's a complex picture of ecological change. Driven by these new species, new practices, and a different mindset about humans' relationship to the natural world.
Precisely. And these changes weren't just happening in a vacuum. It fueled conflict. Impacted trade. And reshaped the very environment that both the Spanish and indigenous peoples depended on. It's a side of the story we can't ignore.
It really makes you think about the long-term consequences of our actions, intended or not. Speaking of consequences, let's talk about the ethical implications of what was happening in the Spanish frontier north. We've talked about just war.
Right.
But I'd like to dive deeper into that concept. What were the arguments for and against the legitimacy of Spanish conquest?
It's a question that has echoed through the centuries, hasn't it? Was the conquest justified?
Right.
The Spanish, like many conquering powers before and after them, wrestled with this question, creating elaborate legal and moral frameworks to justify their actions. They argued that indigenous peoples, lacking Christianity, what they considered civilized governance, were somehow lesser than and therefore subject to Spanish rule.
Right.
It was a way to rationalize their claim to the land, the resources, and even the people.
It's amazing how easily humans can justify their actions, even when those actions are clearly exploitative and harmful.
It's a tale as old as time, sadly. But it's important to remember that even then there were dissenting voices within Spain itself, people who dared to question the morality of it all. Men like Bartolomé de las Casas, who we've mentioned before.
Right.
He witnessed the brutality firsthand and dedicated his life to advocating for the inherent rights of indigenous peoples.
He sounds like a remarkable figure, a true voice of conscience in a time when it would have been easier to stay silent.
He was a thorn in the side of the Spanish establishment, that's for sure. But his writings, his arguments, they mattered. They challenged the status quo and helped to shape laws and regulations, even if they couldn't completely stop the exploitation. These debates over just war, over the rights of indigenous peoples, these weren't just academic exercises. They had real-world consequences.
It reminds us that history is not just something that happened in the past.
Right.
It's a conversation that continues to this day.
Absolutely.
We're still grappling with the legacy of colonialism and conquest, trying to figure out how to move forward in a way that acknowledges past wrongs and strives for a more just future.
Exactly. The Spanish frontier north is a powerful reminder of that ongoing struggle. But let's shift gears now and talk about the legacy of this period on the modern Southwest. Even after all these centuries, it's impossible to ignore the lasting impact the Spanish had on the region, isn't it?
It's everywhere you look.
Right.
It's in the names of cities.
Yeah.
The architecture.
Right.
Even the food we eat. It's like the past is woven into the present. Where do we see the most obvious and lasting influences?
Let's start with something many of us encounter daily. Language.
Okay.
Spanish is spoken throughout the Southwest, a testament to the deep linguistic and cultural influence of that era.
It's true. You can't talk about the Southwest without talking about the Spanish language.
Yeah.
And then there's that beautiful architecture. It's so distinct.
Exactly. Those adobe buildings, the mission churches, the plazas, they all have roots in Spanish colonial design.
Right.
But they've also been shaped by indigenous traditions and the realities of life in the Southwest.
Right.
It's a unique blend that you don't find anywhere else.
And of course, we can't forget the food.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the most iconic dishes of the Southwest.
Yeah.
Chile rellenos, enchiladas, tacos.
Don't forget tamale.
Right, tamales. They all trace their roots back to a fusion of Spanish and indigenous culinary traditions. It's a delicious reminder that cultural exchange, even in the midst of conflict, can lead to something new and exciting and tasty.
It's proof that history isn't just dates and battles.
Right.
It's alive and well in the flavors, the sounds, the very fabric of our lives.
Well said. And it's not just the tangible things, right?
Right.
What about traditions like fiestas, rodeos, mariachi music? They all point back to that Spanish colonial past and still thrive today.
They do. And they show how deeply intertwined those Spanish and indigenous cultures have become over the centuries. The Spanish frontier north wasn't just a temporary blip on the radar. It fundamentally reshaped the region, leaving its mark on the culture, the environment, even the very identity of the Southwest.
You've painted an incredible picture of a period that's so often simplified or misunderstood. What I'm taking away from this deep dive is that the Spanish frontier north is a story of ambition, conflict, and yes, tragedy, but it's also a story of resilience, adaptation, and the blending of cultures that continues to shape the Southwest today.
Beautifully said. It's a reminder that the past is never truly past. It echoes through the generations in ways both big and small. So the next time you find yourself in the Southwest, take a moment to appreciate the layers of history beneath your feet, the echoes of voices long gone, and the stories whispered by the wind. The Spanish frontier north is a story that's still being written,